Welcome to our conversations on COVID and development here at the Center for Global Development.
I'm very happy that today we have with us Susanna Moorehead, who's the chair of the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD. And I should say, in interest of full disclosure, that Susanna and I are not only old friends, but also have been at one point in our careers colleagues when we both worked together at the UK Department for International Development. So Susanna, welcome. We're very happy to have you with us.
Well, thank you for asking me.
I thought, Susanna, in your role, you have this kind of unique perch on the world of development assistance. You have all the countries that are members of the OECD DAC, but you also have a very extensive program of engagement with other countries that are not yet members or not members, but have an active role in development assistance. And of course, I know you also have a extensive outreach program with developing countries that are beneficiaries of a lot of this assistance and partners in this cooperation. And of course, everything has been impacted by the COVID crisis now. You've been talking, I'm sure, to all of your members and to all of these other stakeholders. And I thought we might just start with getting a little bit your sense on how you see the different development agencies reacting to the COVID crisis in the near term. What has this brought out in terms of strengths and also limitations of the existing system? And then we could go on from there to start thinking about what the footprint of this crisis will be for the longer term. So.
Okay. Let me start by saying, I think for development, but also for the world, this is a crisis unlike any other. And I think about it as the beginning of the 21st century. Masood. I'm frequently quite critical of people who say, oh, well, during the Ebola crisis, we did this, or during the financial crisis, we did that. The paradox for people working in development cooperation is that instead of it being a crisis happening somewhere else in the world, that we need to mobilize to help, the biggest hit was that it was happening to us domestically. And I think that completely changed the way that a lot of governments and individuals felt about it. I think negatively, it's meant that people have been very distracted and very, very focused on what's happening, in their own lives, but also in their own countries, worried about jobs, a sense of there just being too much going on to be able to think about the countries and the people who we're normally focused on. Positively, I think it's brought home to people how vulnerable we all are to hidden threats in the case of COVID, how quickly livelihoods actually can be disrupted, how devastating it is when people lose their jobs, and how much we rely on people who are often invisible to us. The people who pick up the rubbish, the people who work in care homes, the people who drive the buses. So I think it's made development professionals, diplomats, civil servants think very differently about development. In the immediate onset of the crisis, I think agencies did the obvious things. They reprogrammed where they could, particularly into the health sector. They brought forward money where they could. They put resources into existing mechanisms that they knew worked. So, one of the things that shone out for me is just what a good thing social safety nets are, particularly if they're digital and you can increase payments very, very easily by mobile phones. But against that, many colleagues were pulled off development work, either for safety reasons, or there were massive consular loads in embassies, or they were redeployed if they were based in capitals. So the system, has been under a huge amount of stress and pressure. I think one of the things that struck me so much by the responses that we've had in OECD countries is it's what we talk about in development as the triple nexus. So you've got to deal with the immediate humanitarian crisis, but you've got to start planning for the longer term economic recovery, and you've got to build the peace. And if you look at almost all DAC member countries, that's exactly what they've done. So it's ironic that our own countries have actually borrowed, if you like, a policy proposal from development in order to tackle this crisis. And I think if you look at the fiscal stimulus packages, what's happening now to try and get the economies restarting, for those of us who work in development, this all sounds really quite familiar. I think the big difference is that there doesn't seem to be any shortage of cash. Whereas, of course, when you're doing this in developing countries, you're always having to think about very, very scarce financial and other resources. So there's been a lot of learning, and it's not over yet. I suppose the thing that is most worrying is I think none of us really know the full impact either of the health crisis in developing countries or the real economic consequences. And I think inevitably it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better.
Yes. I mean, I think what you just said really is quite important to just spend a minute on it, because as you say, we have in rich countries seen kinds of response, both in the speed of the response and in terms of the magnitude of the response, $10 trillion worth of fiscal that we have never seen in the history of the world. So there's really no precedent for it. And we have broken all kinds of self-imposed policy norms and taboos. And those of us who are looking at it from a development perspective would say this is the right thing to have done. If not now, when would you do it? This is a once in a 3-generation crisis, and the world needs to respond to it. But then if you look at the response that we are enabling in the developing countries, I mean, quite frankly, my sense is that we have never seen such a stark contrast between what we have been willing to do at home and what we have demonstrated as being able to do abroad. And in developing countries, the magnitude of the response has been so severely constrained by their own resources and by their lack of access to international capital markets, that if you put on one side the sort of needs, which I think at one point Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF early on in the crisis put a number of $2.5 trillion out there as being the needs for financing, and probably now I would say it's larger rather than smaller, that number. And some of it was going to be met from domestic resources, but domestic resources are themselves going to be under strain as these economies are stagnant or contracting for a couple of years. And a lot of it is going to come from international resources. And against that, you sort of stack up what is the volume of the money that is liberated by the debt service initiative for the poor countries, or the money that the international financial institutions are putting out, or the money that can be redirected from ODA, development assistance, And it adds up, at the moment, about tens of billions of dollars, mid to high tens, if by the end of the year, I think. So there's really a sort of big gap. And as you say, I mean, we're going to pay the price of this, both in terms of the long-term economic consequences and sort of seeing the developmental progress that we've seen for a decade being set back, and also maybe other crises down the road, whether we're going to see famine or doubling of deaths from malaria, HIV, TB, if we don't see action to prevent them. And poverty numbers for the first time in a decade start going up rather than down. So I think you're absolutely right to say that, this is a huge crisis, which we are not yet even halfway through. We're sort of at the early stage in terms of the economic consequences that we will continue to see for some time, and the shadow will be long. And I guess what that raises for me, and I'd be interested in your views on this, is many people will now sort of say, well, of course, ODA is only, concessional assistance is only one part of this package, but it's a critical part for many, many reasons. And we need to now redeploy it to try and deal with the COVID crisis, with global health security, and there are also so many other claims on concessional assistance. So this is just going to add on to the list of people who are saying, my purpose in deploying this is more important than anything else. And better than anyone that, when you talk about how it is deployed, I mean, there are different ways in which one can think about it, but there are opportunities for redeploying it for better outcome. But everything people do, they do for a reason. And sometimes the reasons are political, sometimes the reasons are developmental, but there is a reason why people are spending money the way they do. I want to get your sense of how you see this crisis feeding into the sort of conversation on the purposes of development assistance and how best to use it in ways that reflect the sort of new realities that come from the COVID crisis.
Ooh, okay, there's a lot there. So I'm very struck. I was chairing a DAC meeting yesterday, and I was ticked off by one of my members for being too gloomy. Now you know why. I mean, you've just sketched out exactly why I feel gloomy, and I think the reversals in the progress we've made. I mean, look at Asia. Is particularly South Asia are really frightening, and we tend to forget that even in middle income countries, the number of people who are just hovering above the poverty line, and they get a shock, and they go right back down again. I think the question for me is why we're not more concerned in rich countries about what's happening in poor countries. And, I read your very good piece in the Daily Telegraph, and there's a bit of me that sort of thinks we're borrowing so much that, ODA at the moment, it's only 153 billion. And I say only compared to, what our governments are spending on our schemes, that if you just borrowed a little bit more, it would get lost in the rounding, frankly. So why isn't that happening? I think that's the first question we've got to ask. And it's partly, as I said earlier, distraction, bandwidth. I mean, treasuries are having to sort of work out policies that they would normally spend years figuring out and stress testing and one thing another. But I think it's also that we need a different narrative, a different case for this. When we had our dialogue with civil society organizations, they said DAC members should be much more aggressive about asking for more ODA. And I said, I disagree. I think we've got to be more persuasive. And I don't think we have the arguments that will persuade people where they are now. So, you know, you think all the progress that we made, if you think of the famines in the mid-1980s or Gleneagles, those arguments are not persuading taxpayers or politicians. So, you know, ODA, I mean, we issued a statement in April, and we said we would strive to protect ODA. Every conversation I've had with people in capitals from the members of the DAC are doing their best, but you know, they are not doubling their efforts because they're just not in that space. So as I say, they can move it around by reprogramming, they can front load, which just postpones the problem, but we're not seeing that global response. And consequently, I mean, your question about where we push it and how we ration it becomes ever more important, because the demand is growing exponentially. And, you know, we hope that it will go up, but it's certainly not going to go up at the kind of pace we need. Capital, as you say, is going elsewhere, or not, certainly not going into poor countries. Remittances are down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what has to happen in order to tackle this issue? When I'm being gloomy, I think it's going to have to come onto our television screens in ways that you know, we haven't seen for many years. I mean, not just in fragile states, but really in many poor countries with people who don't have enough to eat, where the excess mortality is going through the roof. I mean, I think that the possibility of a very large-scale humanitarian crisis is not something that we can rule out. I mean,
it's a lot more likely today, I think. Mark Lowcock and his colleagues have worked out the numbers, and they feel that it's much more likely now than it was before the crisis that we're going to see a huge increase in the number of people with food insecurity.
I mean, it's an additional 270 million or something, I think. You know, I mean, it's huge. So, you know, that's the gloomy side, and there is not going to be enough resource to deal with that. I think you know, for most donors, every penny that you put into humanitarian is money that doesn't go into development. So, you know, the more that goes into the health crisis, the more that goes into the food crisis, the less is going to go into protecting jobs and livelihoods. So, yeah, I mean, it's very gloomy. I mean, to try and flip it and say, how do we have a more positive conversation? I think it's becoming a bit of a cliche, but this phrase, build back better, you know, I think there are opportunities to do things differently. I mean, for a start, you know, that all those projects and programs that you kind of wish you'd never started can be stopped. I think there's been a you know, really quite remarkable solidarity of purpose, say, with African finance ministers in their statements to the G20 and others. I think when you look at, I mean, you mentioned, Kristalina, what the IMF and the World Bank have been doing, you know, that there are real beacons of hope. But I don't have an answer to, you know, where these resources are going to come from. What I do know is that ODA won't provide the answer. It can do some of it. Right. And, you know, as you know, it will go to the most in need. But my worry is that the numbers who need it are going to be just enormous.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, you could also sort of push this argument a bit further and say, even before the COVID crisis hit us, you and I had this conversation, I think, a year ago, that we needed to come up with a narrative for ODA and for development assistance that was compelling for people today, because we had to start from the recognition that the narrative that we had 15 years ago was no longer one that worked for many, many people. Still worked for a dedicated community of people who could see that there was a purpose to it, that was self-evident. But what appeared self-evident to some was sort of not very clear or compelling to others. And we had to recognize that the way people thought about what are the purposes of development assistance and what they should be supporting as global causes, if you like, wasn't identical to what people thought 15 years ago, and also because the world had moved on. We've made enormous progress over the last 15, 20 years, just as we have over the last 50 years in terms of human development indicators, in terms of the numbers of people who are living in absolute poverty. So I think one of the things that we need to also recognize is that the last 2 generations have been unprecedented period of human progress. And the problems that we now have are problems that are both more contained and targeted, but also problems that are, for that reason, harder to tackle because they all require a tailored solution in ways that a sort of generalized lifting of all boats no longer works. So these are the boats that don't get reached by the lifting tide, so in a way we have to sort of find ways to deal with them. And I think now with COVID, if anything, that case will have to be made even more forcefully, because right now we're in the big spending mode in the rich countries. But in 2 years' time, as we come through this crisis, the treasuries of the rich countries will start looking at their own balance sheets and suddenly thinking, well, now's the time to really look at every piece that we can tighten down and cut back on. And so the need for us to be able to make a case for development assistance in that environment is something we need to start thinking about now. And one dimension of that I wanted to kind of get your sense on is how we think about the role of new players in development. That, of course, over the last decade or so, the new players have become quite big, China being the most obvious one in terms of being the largest financier of development in many African countries and in other developing countries also, but not only China. And they are providing funding, but they're also providing a vision of how to develop societies and economies most effectively. And sometimes the sort of views and approaches are more similar than people like to think between the sort of traditional providers and the newer providers, but sometimes they're quite different. And I wanted to get a little bit your sense of how you see that dialogue between the old, or I don't want to call them old, but think of them as a sort of more established providers of development assistance, members of the DAC, and the newer development players. How does that evolve? And recognizing also that 2 of the biggest economies in the world, China and the United States, have a political relationship right now, which is probably more difficult than it's ever been, which makes cooperation in any field a bit harder and spills over into development. And I know you have a lot of interaction with the new players. I want to get a little bit your take on this set of issues.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, let me start just by agreeing with you about the success of ODA, and I think one of the reasons that it's so difficult now is because all those children who didn't die as a consequence of our success in delivering some of the MDGs are now 20 and need jobs. So I mean, I think it's really important, to remember the positive things. I do, however, I think we oversold the simplicity. And in a sense, the Sustainable Development Goals reflected the complexity. And that's the beginning of the story for me, of a more compelling narrative, that this is not a technical thing you can just fix. And you put your finger on it, Masood. At the end of the day, this is about politics and power, both in developing countries, between countries, and taking it right up to the global stage. I mean, I'm glad. I don't like to think of the DAC as the traditional donors, partly because there's lots and lots of new members, and countries like China actually have been providing assistance to other countries for many years. However, I'm conscious of the fact that we have a reputation as being, the rich men's club. So I'm doing what I can, certainly on the gender side, to improve that. I think, what makes the DAC stand apart is that it's a values-based group of donors. And, the rules that we agree to together and hold each other to account for, and publish the data that provides the evidence to say we're doing that, makes us very different from all the rest. Now, it's absolutely critical that we engage with other donors, but also with the private sector and civil society organizations and foundations. But we have to maintain our values-based approach. And it's interesting. I mean, the committee has very differing views on China, as you would expect. I mean, you've talked about the US-China relationship, but particularly for our Asian members, I mean, they have a very different approach, which is you can't ignore it, you need to find ways of engaging and talking and having the dialogue. Rather like when we met in Beijing last year. I mean, I think that was a very powerful signal that you can't talk about development without talking about China. And China does things differently. And I don't think any of us have, the unique solution to development. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, we kind of oversold what we could do technically, and I think what we could do through the economies. I mean, we thought if we could just get these economies growing, everything would be fine. So, nobody has the key. I think the most interesting thing is, what is it like if you are a developing country? And I often ask myself, what's it like dealing with a DAC donor as opposed to dealing with China? Or indeed some of the Arab donors who we also have a dialogue with. And you hear very differing stories, but I think many DAC donors, there is a perception that the flip side of our transparency, our results focus, our need to ensure value for money, development effectiveness, et cetera, is that we have become more and more bureaucratic over time. And particularly, I think, an unintended consequence of focus on results, it's made us do things that we can count and that we can photograph and that we can see. I think China is very different to deal with, and I'm very struck. I mean, I was in a small island developing state. And there was an enormous Chinese delegation that arrived. And it was a turnkey operation. I mean, you had the politicians, you had the engineers, you had the financiers, you had, the evaluators, the translators, everything. And you could see if you're a government and you get that kind of mission come in, and it's what do you want? Do you want roads? Do you want railways? Do you want, I don't know, new government buildings? Just sign here and it's done. And there's something really
quite attractive about that, yeah, especially
and I think
you
for
have
us
to deliver in time for your next election.
Yeah, and for us just to say we know best, and that's not the way to do it. I think we have quite a lot to learn from an approach that is a sort of start to finish operation. Conversely, as we know, there is I think increasing recognition that there is a huge amount of corruption surrounding, some of these deals. And I think very, very interestingly, in many partner countries, there's a growing recognition that, some people are doing very well out of this, the political elites are, but actually the debt is carried by the whole citizenry, and they're not necessarily benefiting. So I do think that the sort of power dynamics are changing. There are pros and cons on both sides. And if we were designing a new way of thinking about development cooperation, I think you would have to take the best of the DAC, which I do think is the rules and the values and the transparency and the development effectiveness, some of the efficiencies of other countries. Sometimes the speed with which other donors are able to work. Triangular cooperation. There's a lot to be said. If you look at what India does in terms of triangular cooperation. They've done more development than practically any other country. And I defy anybody to come up with a development program that hasn't already been tried in India, probably many, many times over. So, there's a need to have a different sort of conversation. And I think particularly to move away from this idea of donor and recipient. And I know that sounds a bit trite, but I'm struck that as many DAC members have moved away from direct budget support for reasons that are very well known, there's been a much less of a conversation with ministries of finance, with sort of political leadership of countries. And I think we need to restart that sort of genuine dialogue to come up with better ways of working. And last but by no means least, to say to partner countries, if you're going to hold DAC members to these very high standards that we agreed in Paris, Accra, and so on, then you've got to hold everybody to them. You can't expect us just to do this if you then let every other donor operate in different ways. And then that sense of mutual accountability, I think, needs to come back far more. But none of that. That will enable us to use the resources we have as well as we can to make the ODA work harder, if you like.
But it doesn't raise the amount of ODA you've got.
But it doesn't raise the amount of ODA. And even if every single DAC member reached their 0.7, which of course will go down if the economy shrinks, it's still never going to be enough. So in a way, the real conversation, I think, is about how do we get private investors to come in more? What can we do? And I'd be interested in in your views, what can we do to really use the World Bank and the IMF and the regional development banks? Are we giving development finance institutions the right signals? I mean,
Right.
are we taking enough risk? What are we going to do to sort of pull all that money down into these countries? And I think for me, that's the starting point for building back better. Is, how are we going to pay for this at scale? And that's going to have to be the private sector. And one of the first things that it's got to do is to generate jobs. I think traditionally employment generation has not really been front and center for a lot of DAC donors, but at the end of the day, that is the key.
Yes, and without that, it's very hard to see sustainable progress on
how
the
do
other
you
areas.
how do you pull whole generations out of poverty if they don't have a job?
Yes, I mean, I think all of this conversation that needs to happen, thinking about what are the different pathways to development, thinking about what are the ways in which concepts of mutual accountability can be applied more generally. I guess I'm still struggling in my head as to where all this will happen. So in some ways, I've in my earlier incarnations attended a few of your august meetings at DAC when I used to go represent the UK at the DAC at the subset of meetings. And inevitably, it is by its design, it's a group that is designed to focus on what they do and then try make it do better. And there are dialogues with others, but what I'm still trying to find is sort of how do we get a conversation going that will look at some of these more basic, fundamental, really broader questions about what you think are different pathways and how you can support them. And one of the challenges, I hope that maybe at the next the Development Leaders Conference that VCGD do, which does try to bring together people from all of the development world, we could begin to explore some of these ideas, and what you've talked about will be a very good starting point for that. But we have to find some other ways also to take this conversation forward globally, it does seem to me.
I mean, can I make a bold proposition? Maybe
go for it.
Maybe the problem is that development people talk to development people too much.
Yes.
And we become it's a sort of self-licking lollipop after a while. And I'm very struck by the fact that even in our own countries, how little conversation there is between development and environment, for example. And then, we love to castigate developing countries because they don't take a whole of government approach. Well, show me a government that does. And a lot of what we're talking about is about finance, actually. So unless you have your ministries of finance at the table, and actually your head of government, it's very hard to see how you're going to sort of break out of this development cycle. And I think we're all very conscious that there is not global leadership on shaping this new conversation. And one would hope that when you have a global public bad like COVID, that the response would
or
be
climate change, which is just
climate change.
COVID in slow motion on its way,
Yep, let's invest in global public goods. But to do that, you need political leaders to really champion it. And I think that loops back to what we were saying earlier about why is it that political leaders are not more focused on this. Now, I think, we know the short answer because they're distracted and because, some political leaders are much more skeptical about multilateralism, rise of nationalism. You have, I think, a lot of questioning about globalization. There are all those sort of isms around, but it is, I think, a genuinely paradoxical that at just the moment when you have these enormous global threats, that our politics is going in the opposite direction.
Yes.
And I don't know what you do about that. I think, if you look at Extinction Rebellion or a lot of the youth movements, that's driven by a lot of alienation. I think an alienation from politics as delivered by our generation. But what you don't have yet, and I'm an optimist at heart. I think what you don't have yet is a movement or leadership that really has any sort of sense of direction. But it's ironic. I mean, the improvement in air quality. I mean, in Paris, in Delhi. I mean, you could see the Himalaya from Delhi. When could you last do that? Not for decades. People noticed that during lockdown. People noticed that, it is possible to change things, and yet our preoccupations are far more local and immediate. So yeah. I don't. How do you kickstart that debate? And it's not just a development debate. I think that's the point.
I think. Look, first, I would just say I agree with you 100% that the issues we're talking about don't fit neatly into any box. They're not contained within some traditionally defined box of development. They're not contained within some traditionally defined box of environment or health. And it's really bringing these conversations and the people who are thinking about these issues together, not with the objective of ensuring that at the end the other person is entirely convinced of the merits of my argument, but actually trying to see collectively how you forge a new way of thinking about global issues, which just take into account the fact that these issues are multifaceted in exactly the ways you're saying. Now, to be fair to some of your members, I would say they've made more progress in getting towards a sort of whole of government approach than others have. I think sometimes I almost think that, that part of this conversation has to start from recognizing that not everything that we hold dear, no matter where we sit, is going to be held equally dear by others who sit in other places and who are equally motivated, but they just see a different set of global issues as being more compelling. And then we have to sort of find ways of working them together. And maybe the answer is that it's not only going to come from the top, it's also going to come from exactly the kinds of youth movements that you were talking about. Look at what happened pre-COVID. 2019, I think, was the year in which climate change became mainstream for so many finance ministers. Why did we suddenly end up with a coalition of global, finance ministers against climate change? We have a sort of central bank governors all talking about climate change. And partly it's self-enlightenment, they come to terms with the thing, but partly also it's the politics that was changing, in part because literally tens or hundreds of thousands of young people were out on the street saying they wanted to see faster and more aggressive action on it. So maybe part of the solution to the future of the world lies in the people who will be inhabiting it. It is the young people who are going to help carve out the way for the directions and help push us to shed some of our priors.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're right, but I also think that it's incumbent on us to do something as well. And I do, you know, I mean, don't want to be sort of too esoteric. I mean, so, you know, what could be done? And I mean, one of the things that I wonder about is, you know, has all the architecture, whether it's around environment, development, you know, different forms of finance, is that just too complicated? You know, is it, we've had this, you know, we've got vertical funds, we've got development banks, we've got, I mean, you wouldn't design it if you were starting out, not do all that. And I do wonder whether, you know, something that would help the resources we have go further, make them easier to access, wouldn't be some sort of rationalization of all the different pots of money and institutions. And, you know, I mean, the Development Assistance Committee is one very small part of that. But when I look at all the things that DAC members finance, you just think this makes no sense. So, you know, I think that would be something that would be very, very interesting to explore. Now, it's tricky, of course, just like, you know, all institutional changes, but
worth thinking about. Yeah,
definitely worth thinking about. I think it's also thinking much more about, I mean, pooling the different sources of finance as well. I mean, a lot of the climate finance is dealt with entirely separately from the development finance, and I think, you know, it's feedback that we get from a lot of partner countries that it's just so time-consuming and difficult. That is in our gift. I mean, a lot of this stuff, we don't know what to do about it. And you know, but I think that...
and I think that's in a way is where DAC becomes essential, because this whole question of sort of, I mean, this is getting a little bit insider baseball, but, you know, all these conversations around the intricacies of ODA definitions, what's in and what's out, and how you measure effectiveness. And then, you know, all of that, I think, are rules that we set up, you set up, and DAC set up to ensure that for a particular vision of the purpose of development assistance, the funding was going to be used effectively and for purposes that lay within that broad vision. And in some ways, you know, at one point, it's sort of the self-imposed rules need to adapt to the reality of what people want to do and think is worth doing. And there's always a process of catch-up. And I think what one needs, maybe there's a separate conversation that we need to schedule, is sort of, you know, if you were to, we'll come and ask you to sort of think out 5 years out or 10 years out, you know, what will be the sort of DAC definition, order definitions and DAC rules look like, you know, in a world where people think differently.
See, it's ironic. I mean, I'm laughing because before I did this job, I thought the DAC rules were far less permissive than they are.
Yes.
And, you know,
and you want to keep people thinking that.
Well, it depends. It depends what you want to do. And, you know, what each member does is to take the DAC rules, and then they have their own legislative framework and their own policy choices. And that triumvirate, if you like, gives you some very, very different outcomes. So, you know, some members think that as much ODA as possible should be focused on the very poorest people in the very poorest countries. Bang. Others say, well, no, actually, for historical reasons, we're going to put it into a middle income country, or for geographic reasons, our near neighborhood is particularly important, and we judge, our neighborhood to be particularly vulnerable for other reasons. So there's a huge diversity of views. And I mean, that goes back to what you said earlier. Some of these views are very dearly held. And when we have difficult conversations about changing the rules, and we're in the middle of one at the moment on debt, I'm always very struck by the range of issues that we're really talking about. So, is a grant always better than a loan? Some people think yes, other people say no. It depends on what it's for, what the terms are, who you're lending it to. So there's a huge diversity of opinion. Another one is, should we be investing so much in fragile states? Or actually, should we be investing more in success? Is it important in very, very fragile regions to actually have some islands of stability for demonstration effects, for positive externalities, rather than just pouring money into very fragile situations, and on and on and on. Should we
could make? It'd be quite interesting to actually line up a sort of trade-offs in thinking about this, right? So you could have fragile states or islands of success. Should you invest where the money is best used, or where the money is most needed? Should you invest in the poorest and poor countries, or should you invest in global public goods?
Or do you invest in the very poorest people who have to consume it?
Right.
Do you invest in those just hovering on the poverty line? I think
we should organize a debate on this.
We could.
Yeah, we should do a debate on it. All right, look, I don't want to keep you for much longer. I know you have other stuff to do, but what I think this sort of has a feeling of an unfinished conversation to me. And I think we need to come back in 6 months' time, and we will pick up on some of the issues that you've raised, and I think it'd be quite interesting also to take up this idea of organizing a sort of counterpoint on these choices that people are constantly making, but sometimes without having a frank conversation about the underlying rationale for them.
Exactly.
It's often historical rather than anything else.
Well, and that we think we know best, Masood.
Yes. Each of us thinks they know best.
And that we have this theory of change, and that, it's sort of shorthand, but kind of embedded in the Millennium Development Goals. If you educated children and you kept them healthy and you've got the economies growing, then woof, off it goes. But if you look at the history of the world, this has very rarely happened like that, if anywhere. So I think we should. And I think it's, if I'm a finance minister in a developing country, you're actually making those trade-offs all the time.
Yes.
And I think if we're really going to rethink development cooperation, and we're really going to be serious about building back better, then we need to get rid of some of these these assumptions that we make about how countries develop, and ask people. You said, ask younger people, ask governments, ask civil society, ask women, who very rarely get asked these questions, even though they often have quite good ideas.
Better than most of us. Susanna, it's always fantastic talking to you. It's been great. And as I say, I see this as a sort of part one of a part two conversation, or multi-part conversation, I should say, which we will come back to in a few months. In the meantime, stay safe. I was very pleasantly reminded of life in Paris when I heard fleetingly one of the French emergency vehicles go past your apartment. And since each emergency vehicle has their own distinct sound, siren in different cities, you could immediately say that you were sitting at the moment in Paris, and a very nice reminder of July in Paris without tourists.
Indeed. Well, look, thank you, Masood, and definitely let's continue this conversation. I mean, I'm in the market for good ideas, and I would just like to say what a fantastic job CGD is doing on this. I mean, my inbox, I always open the email from CGD and I always learn something. So thank you for everything that you and your team are doing.
Thank you so much. Take care.